Hello, my wife.
Hi.
Welcome.
That's how we're starting. Hello, my.
Yes. Hello, my wife. Welcome to my podcast. Welcome to Physical Education. And welcome to you, viewers out in the world. I am sitting here with my wife, Hilary Neblett. And we have actually recorded this before. This is the second time we were recording this. The first time we talked for a very long time. And as sure as I am that you would love to hear all of that, we thought it might be make more sense to maybe split some of those thoughts into different episodes of this that are a little more directed. So if there's something in here that while we're talking you're like, wow, it's really interesting, let me know. We can talk about it at greater length, for sure. uh,
Mhm.
but without further ado, Hill, why don't you introduce yourself, tell people a little bit about your background, and then I can talk about kind of why I brought you on, why I think this is an interesting conversation, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, sure. So yeah. Hi everyone. I'm Hilary. I'm a therapist here in Austin in private practice. My private practice has been open for about a year and a half now. Almost 2 years. So yeah, thanks.
Mhm.
And this is my second career. I came from like a whole different uh industry. I used to work in events and entertainment, went back to school, and yeah, now able to kind of think and learn about all the stuff that is interesting to me.
Sweet. Very cool. Um, and the reason I, I've had talking to you on my list for a while is because we often talk at home about sort of the intersection between physical health and mental health, between how, some of the stuff that you do for work shows up in your practice in the gym and maybe vice versa. I think a lot of people have some understanding that, mental health is a component of your physical health and sort of vice versa. And so I thought it'd be an
Hmm.
interesting thing to kind of like, talk about it in, with a little more, kind of nuance and kind of a deeper dive into that than just like the kind of like rote, like, hey, going to the gym makes you feel good and blah, 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 whatever that is.
Yeah.
So to start, we're going to start this episode and the kind of way that we've talked about this and planned it out is to do a little bit of kind of background work, right? It's not assumed. I think, it's not assumed that everybody knows certainly about fitness, but certainly about mental health. And so I want to start with just some background about you and about what you do to set the stage before we kind of like start tying pieces together about, how fitness, how mental health kind of work together. So first, let's talk about you and sort of like just a brief overview of sort of your fitness background and how you got to kind of the point where you're at right now and involved in, my gym, our gym. And yeah,
Yeah.
lead us through.
Yeah. So yeah, I would say that like, you know, I didn't really grow up being super involved in fitness, never played sports, anything like that, and but really started to kind of dabble more in my like early 20s, kind of various forms of strength training, doing little bits and bobs here and there. But didn't really totally get serious about it, like in the way that I am now, until I was in like my late 20s. And sort of like this happenstance sort of thing, I ended up just one New Year's Eve, like being like, I'm going to sign up for a sprint triathlon in June, just as something to like kind of push myself on. Um, and what I learned throughout like kind of that 6 months, I became like, very consistent with my training. And it was the first time I'd ever really kind of stuck with a plan for that long. And it really showed me, not just like the physical sort of benefits of that, but I noticed a lot of other residual benefits and sort of like my overall, like, I tend to be kind of an anxious person. Um, and it really kind of helped me kind of like balance out my baseline day to day. I noticed some big changes, and that really, I think, helped me, stay consistent to it and became kind of another why of why I stayed consistent with it. And then when, I moved to Austin, um, and was again sort of like experimenting with different sort of forms of fitness, met you.
And
Um,
then it all changed.
yeah, I was at this other gym, just kind of like your regular, like, I don't know what you call it, like a basic sort of.
I wouldn't call it, we often say Globo Gym, but it's not a Globo Gym. We're talking Castle Hill Fitness, which is an awesome privately owned gym
Yeah.
in Austin.
Yeah,
Yeah.
loved it. They had this class on Saturdays that was what I now understand as, kind of a functional fitness-based class. And I would talk to you about it and be like, "Oh my God, we did like power cleans today." And it was like, I learned how to do it. This is really cool. And you were like, "Yeah, you should come over to to our gym
It's
and
like,
try this. This sounds, this
because
sounds like."
at first when we started dating, you were a little resistant and you were like, "Ah, I don't know." And when you started talking about that, I was like, I think you're doing what we do. So maybe try it.
Yeah, yeah. And so I did and became, yeah, really into it. And it's, become like really one of my favorite forms of fitness. Yeah.
Cool. So to kind of like tie these things together, let's talk about your work as a therapist. So like, what is your client work like? What do you work with? What kind of issues do you work with people on? What's like sort of like some commonalities with the people you work with and the things that they're, coming to you for?
Yeah. Yeah, so my work is pretty varied, but it does kind of boil down to a couple different things, a lot of like anxiety, in all sort of different forms, whether it's related to relationships
The
or
scourge
just
of
sort
the
of like
21st century.
just sort of like living in the world right now.
Existing. I deal
Just
with
existing.
existing.
Um yeah, and a lot of like excuse me, like kind of shame and self-worth kind of work. A lot of people come to me with, kind of the initial goal of like, hey, I really want to like build confidence and want to, I don't really trust myself, kind of like, dealing with stuff with like feeling incapable in certain areas. I deal with like I work with a lot of young adults. So a lot of it's sort of like, identity work, kind of figuring out who I am, who I want to be, kind of like separating from like the pressures of the world. Um, and yeah, I'd say that's a summary.
So we talked a little bit about like, who you work with, what you work on, right? Is that the who and the what? And now I want to talk a little bit about the how, right? Like, what
Yeah.
is your overall sort of like philosophy of treatment or the kind of like your approach to helping people with those things that we just talked about?
Yeah. Yeah. So the more I do this work, the more like, I think about yeah, what is some of this like what is underlying like a lot of these like different challenges that people face. And sort of the way that I think about it sometimes, or that I'm starting to think about it more, is, how do we a lot of it's like how do we build like a tolerance for uncertainty and ambiguity. And also, like, how do we become like kind of genuinely curious about ourselves and our experience from, a less judgmental stance and more of a, more like a scientist kind of like observing what's happening from a more, um, yeah, neutral sort of stance, because I think a lot of people's tendencies is to like, sort of push yourself with criticism or, those kinds of things. And
Like
I
any
see that.
negative data point is like a derailment point.
Right.
Right.
Or it's um like it's saying something anyway,
Ooh, it says something like deep
yeah,
about me and not just like, oh yeah, it just didn't go the way I want. I
right.
mean, there's a lot. It's funny, we kind of prepped this a little bit last night and we talked about some things, but we actually didn't talk about this. And it's funny because I talk to people in the gym about this a lot. So we'll get into that. I think
Yeah,
that's a
yeah.
very cool way, the kind of curiosity and the sort of like, it's all data approach.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you're working with somebody to kind of like understand that, like how do you work with them to get there? Like I know
Yeah.
the term we throw around is like psychological flexibility, right?
Mhm.
Like what do what helps them tolerate uncertainty? What helps them, foster curiosity?
Right. Yeah, so if those other things were sort of like my general, just like boiling it down to a couple points of change, this psychological flexibility is more connected, like you said, to like the kind of, okay, how do we do that? And so I practice from a modality called acceptance and commitment therapy. That's like kind of like where I ground a lot of my work in. I won't get into too many of the details of like, the nitty gritty of what that is. But essentially, the goal of acceptance and commitment therapy is to increase psychological flexibility, which is kind of a fancy word for, how do we build awareness of our experience, noticing it in the moment. How do we stay open to it, versus trying to control it, trying to avoid it, trying to change it? And then how do we, with all of that happening, how do we continue like taking action, like in line with like our values in that moment? So it's less about changing, thoughts or feelings or approaching it like that, and more like how do we develop a new relationship to them? That's kind of it in a nutshell.
I just thought of this, and this is a little jokey, but is psychological flexibility similar to flexibility in the gym in that it's something everybody knows they need to work on, but doesn't? You go, oh man, I really need to be able to get in this position or stretch my hips or whatever. And then they go, I'll do that tomorrow. Okay, that's a joke. Work on your mobility. Um, but no, let's more seriously talk about this kind of how this shows up in the gym, right?
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people have this feeling, doing what we do, to talk about the kind of points we talked about, tolerating uncertainty, right? The old CrossFit adage is being comfortable with being uncomfortable,
Hmm.
right? And often that's meant like very uh literally, right? Like physically uncomfortable, right? It's like, oh, my body feels gross.
Yeah.
But I mean, like, and I'm okay, right? Like, and the first time you do it, it's can be really distressing. And then over time, I think most people get this idea of like, yeah, it's okay if I am really out of breath. It's okay if I
Right.
am really hot or this or whatever. That doesn't like,
Well, you learn through experience that this doesn't mean that I'm dying.
right,
Right.
right.
Like kind of essentially, I mean, like, because when you kind of, get to that place, I mean, we've talked about this a lot, but when I first started, CrossFit, every third class, I think I just started crying kind of randomly. And like it wasn't like, connected to any sort of, feeling of feeling sad or anything like this. It was literally like my body was kind of like at this point of just like, whoa, what's happening here? Right. And the more that I kind of stuck with it and started to understand that feeling more and be able to kind of like modulate myself within that, like you kind of train your body, not just your body, but also like your mind,
Mhm.
to that like, hey, this is okay. I'm safe here. I can keep going. And like kind of, tying it into like psychological flexibility a little bit. I mean, that's essentially, what we're working on. Yeah. In
Yeah.
in the therapy room, and I think the gym can be such a great training ground for
Well, I think
that.
about it, and I think about like, crying or we've seen other things like that. And it's like, to disclaim, this was during, I think, foundation. So it wasn't necessarily even like that the workouts were so hard or so much volume or whatever. But I do think we have few opportunities in our lives to do things that feel sort of like intense, both from like a level of like both mentally and physically at the same time.
Mm.
Right, and I think so often that's a big benefit of this, specifically sort of like this kind of training what we do where you're very locked in intellectually or intentionally or, like you have to pay a lot of attention, right? And you have to like execute at a high level of sort of like, coordination or something like that. And at the same time, you're getting like pretty intense feelings in your body.
Mhm.
And those sort of two things together, I think for people, it's rare. You have, maybe work where you're like very intellectually focused, but body wise, you don't really have anything. Or you might have something, even if you do, you go on a run that's really hard. You've got a lot of like body focus, but maybe you're not quite as like mentally active. You're a little more like zoned out. And I think having those two things together.
Sure, zoned out, or maybe your mind's doing a lot.
Right.
In like, I mean, I know when I'm running, my mind is kind of constantly going through like, oh man, I don't know about this.
Left foot,
I'm
right
not,
foot, left foot, right foot.
it's like, or in the middle of a metcon or something like that. You're
Right.
like, oh my god, I'm not sure if I can do this. Can I still do this? That sometimes like my mind is working a lot
Yeah.
sometimes in those moments, and I think maybe, um,
Yeah, when I mean like intention, like I mean like thinking of like, okay, my hands need to go here, my this, that. I need to like, there's a level of like locked in. I need to be about like kind of like every single movement to
mhm,
make sure that I'm doing it well. I
mhm,
know for me that helps certainly just things feel like the time goes faster and stuff like that. But I think that can be those two things linked together can be, a lot of the sort of like power of what we train. Um, and what I've seen is that like people, as they get more comfortable doing this stuff, right, as they have experiences where they try something and it's really hard and they get through it, as they, you know, bite off a little more than they can chew, but it ends up being okay. Or they exceed what they thought they could do. Or,
Yeah.
they have a moment where they go, they think something's going to be incredibly hard. And then as they're doing it, they're like, oh, this actually kind of feels good. And I can like cruise here.
Hmm.
That like ability to be comfortable being uncomfortable, to realize that like that is a feeling sort of like any other feeling.
Yeah.
That that can then carry over into other things, right? And then they can like go out and practice that, or practice that, like take the practice here, and use that in other things where they may be feeling uncomfortable, uncertain, sometimes even overwhelmed.
Yeah. Like I can continue on even if I'm feeling really uncomfortable right now. Because kind of what you're describing is sort of like, or, kind of how I'm thinking about it as you're describing it is like, okay, I know I'm feeling really uncomfortable, whether it's physically or mentally or whatever.
Right.
And kind of every moment, especially in the gym, every moment you're deciding kind of how am I going to respond to that?
Hmm.
Am I going to stop? Am I going to continue?
Right.
And the more that you kind of, like continue making that choice, to continue amid discomfort, like,
You're better at making that choice.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and that increases like kind of, overall confidence and sort of, like I mean it can um like we were talking about kind of how it translates like out into the world. It's like, yeah, we can do these things that matter to us, even when
Hmm.
I'm feeling, let's say, anxious, or even when I'm feeling upset, or even when I'm feeling, it doesn't like because there's a lot happens when those feelings come up, and
Right.
we can choose how we respond to them by like, okay, well, either I'm gonna like not continue on and give this presentation or go to this party or whatever, or I'm gonna kind of feel these things, my mind's gonna be telling me all this stuff about what might happen, and I choose to go anyway because
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
I mean, in some ways, like it's the point. Like in the same way that
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
you go to do a challenging workout, and there's going to be a part where you're like, "Oh, this is really hard," and like, yeah, it's the point. Like that's what's going to create, in some way, like that's going to create change. That is the training like stimulus. And in the same way, like
Yeah.
say a social situation or something where you feel anxious or social anxiety or really uncomfortable, and it's like, yeah, it's a point. It probably is because you're like putting yourself out there a little bit, you're stretching a little bit into like an area that is right now, in a gym center, like not fully trained, not fully developed, and that this is almost the kind of like the training stimulus, right? That's a sign of like training stimulus. And certainly, sure, there could probably be times where it's like, no, this is too much. This is like inappropriate for my current level of like development. I need to pull back. And then there's times
Yeah.
where it's like, no, this is uncomfortable and it should be a little, and that's okay.
Yeah, and I think like, it's not about always pushing yourself through discomfort, right? Like what you're
Right.
talking about is like there's a it's also about like the discernment.
It's
So
like finding the appropriate zone.
yeah, and
Yeah.
like having and really it's about, I mean, what I think about a lot in terms of this is like how do I create more space for myself to like make a choice so it's not like an automatic reaction,
Right.
let's say. Because sometimes the appropriate response in the gym is going to be like, you know what? I'm
Too much. Yeah. Got to take some weight off. Yeah. Well,
right,
I think that
right.
discernment, and like one of the things we see with really new people isn't so much that they're like stupid, right? Nobody in my gym is stupid. Uh, but it's often that they don't know their own bodies. Like they don't know what heavy feels like versus light. They don't know what,
Yeah,
like they
they
just
don't have
haven't
like the
developed that like, those sort of Brett likes to call it like the gears, right? Like they haven't developed
yeah, and it's
those.
like how would you know
Right.
unless you like
Well,
experience it?
since a lot of it
Yeah.
is and like experiential and relative, right?
Hmm.
Like heavy is relative to a
Totally. Yeah.
person, and like you need to kind of hit some different data points before you can say, this is heavy, this is medium, heavy or hard or whatever. I think so, socially or sort of like, like broad catch-all kind of like, mental emotional sense, like kind of the same thing. And
Yeah.
if we're not in those situations, we kind of can't create that like relativism. Um, but we can practice it.
Yeah.
Interesting. I want to get into the thing we were talking about before, the sort of like the curiosity. And one of the things that
Yeah.
I think that really for me, when I started doing this stuff was one of the big like ahas and the reasons why I'm like, I love this was that kind of like curiosity, playfulness, exploration, right?
Yeah.
This kind
Yeah.
of like, yeah, you can like try things and they're weird and they're different. And like, I think that, that's one thing. And then sort of staying kind of like mentally curious and treating, I talk to people a lot of times, especially when we're doing stuff like, let's see what the heaviest something we can lift is, or something where there's like a real binary pass fail,
Uh-huh.
is about like, let's go into this with the concept that like we are identifying sort of data points, right? That there's curiosity. It's like, can I lift this much? Right. And if I can't, that isn't like what we said before, some sort of like, well, it means you're a bad person, or it means that your training sucks, or this. It just means like, well, I found the level, like I found my level, right?
Yeah.
Like we said before, like I found my relative heavy or whatever it is. And, treating it like, oh man, I was able to do this, this, and this, but when I got to here, that was too much. And not like, okay, that's me being a bad person, but like, I wonder why that is.
Yeah.
I wonder why I'm able to do X, Y, and Z, but not this, right? Or something
Yeah.
like
Or
that.
what, when it comes to like fitness related stuff, like, okay, like maybe I thought I was gonna be able to do that today, or maybe I've done it before and it didn't go the way I planned. All right, let me think about like what are some of the things, the other contextual sort of factors about this. Like, oh, I not sleep so well.
Right.
Oh, like kind of like, yeah, collecting data from a place of, genuine sort of like observation, right? And some of the ways that I like, one of the ways I love to describe like what's the difference between, genuine curiosity and sort of like a kind of pseudo curiosity is sort of like genuine curiosity is like, looking and go, huh, what is this? Interesting. And, we might use the language of curiosity to like be like, what the hell is this? Where
Okay.
it's like it's a very
Like
different
threatened curiosity.
well, it's like,
Yeah.
what the hell? Yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right. It's a more
Sort
like
of like,
alarm almost versus like pretty neutral. I think you said neutral before and kind of
yeah,
like, is this good? Is this bad? Is this, and maybe not even like positive, negative language,
yeah.
but
I
just
mean,
sort
I'd
of
even
like
like, yeah.
what, like, just like, what is the like the base element of this?
Hmm.
Yeah. We say, we talk in our foundations cycle, we talk about tracking.
Yeah.
I know you're a big tracker
Love tracking.
across all
Love
all
tracking a little
formats.
too much.
On TrackTube, Journal Tube.
There is such a thing
Uh,
as too much data.
yeah.
Yeah.
But we often tell people, we'll show them our tracking tool be on the whiteboard and we'll say, here's how you put in your scores and blah, blah, blah. That is quantitative data. You need that, right? Like
Yeah.
those are your hard objective facts of like, I did this, the next time I did it faster or heavier or whatever it is. But I always push people, it's like, you need qualitative data too. You need to put in what you said before as context, right? Just
Yes.
got back from vacation, right? Had up all night with the baby, something like that, whatever it is,
Right.
or like,
I didn't eat
man,
breakfast this morning.
or push, I think I'm saying things that are like negative influences or like things that might pull your performance down. Also positive ones, right? Like I moved my meal back, an hour before I got to the gym and I felt really good when I usually feel a little like stomach upset or something.
Yeah.
Or, you know, did some extra hip mobility before squatting today and it felt really smooth. And it's like we do these qualitative pieces to give us, to sort of satisfy that curiosity, to like give us those contextual kind of like reinforcements of like, yeah, do this again. Or sometimes I guess don't do this again, right? Don't max out your back squat the day you got back from a 3-week vacation. Like it's probably not gonna be fun, accurate, or like, healthy.
Yeah.
Um
Yeah.
Cool. I think we are like close to, a good time to wrap, and we can always get into deeper issues. Um, I want real quickly to go over like if people are like, man, working on some of these elements more related to mental health sounds like something that would be useful. I want to talk a little bit about resources for that, but also just like any like, last thoughts or things to, you know, leave people with or something that like, a connection or a lesson that's been important to you, sort of like in the mesh space between
Yeah.
your work and what you do here.
Connecting to like why do I do this in the first place? This is one of the things we didn't really talk about when it comes to psychological flexibility that I was maybe alluding to a little bit when
It's
it's
like
like
your
we
why.
don't just like push through discomfort just for the sake of it,
Right.
right? Like it's like what are we doing this in the service of? And you know, yeah, connecting to like, okay, how do I want to respond to this feeling of like frustration or feeling upset? You know, like, do I want to, you know, not go to the gym tomorrow or stop training this or, you know, like punish myself in some way or something like that, right? Or like, do I want to, okay, let myself feel this, reconnect to like, why do I do this hard thing? You know, and make that choice like, okay, I'll try again tomorrow, let's say. Like not letting it, not letting the feeling kind of like control and be the decision maker of like how you move forward.
Yeah, I like the idea of like unhitching the sort of trailer of like meaning from like certainly gym performance. I mean, I'm sure you do that with people in other things, but like
Oh yeah, I mean,
if you're bad at
yeah,
cleans, you are not a bad person. Right?
or you're
If
not
you
like
had a bad day in a
yeah,
workout, it's not because all of the training you've ever done is useless or that you'll never be good or something. Like there often it just wasn't there today, right?
yeah,
Like especially, because a lot of what we do often verges there's like overlap between the training and the actual like performance of it, right? Like and in performances, in sport and things like that, like some people win, some people lose. Like that's part of the whole thing. Like it
mhm,
is not expected that when you go from training to performance that will always be exactly what you want. Like
yeah,
that's why I mean you do it because there is that unknown,
hmm,
right? And so taking that unknown as like, no, this is also part of the point, or even taking those negative things of like, yeah, I tried and I failed. Like, it's like, yeah, and that is also part of the point. Like, that is why we are doing, and certainly not like tying it into some sort of like deeper commentary on ourselves,
yeah, because our mind is always, our minds
making
are
meaning.
just like meaning making
Yeah,
machines,
right.
but like often like the automatic
The
interpretation of
response
what's
is
happened
I'm a
is
shithead.
yeah, it's like
That's
God,
where we
I'm just
start.
so yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'm the
That
worst.
yeah, and it's
Yeah.
and so pausing to kind of question that a little bit, or kind of like, I mean, I like the metaphor that I often use when we talk about like what our mind is doing is like, treating your mind like an advisor and not a dictator,
Mm.
right? Like having like your you can question,
Right.
and take what your mind is saying with a grain of salt and stuff
Right, or
like
say
that.
like, "Thank you for that feedback, but I'm gonna take my own path," or something. Right,
Yeah,
yeah, it's not
yeah.
an imperative.
Mhm.
Very cool. If somebody like I said before, I alluded to it as, like, if somebody's like, "Man, I think I wanna think deeper about these things." Whether it's like, the stuff I do in the gym, or it's
Yeah,
like my life in general, and, this approach seems like it works for me, or like, I think it's a good time to do that.
yeah.
How would somebody go about doing that? Obviously, we've got them covered with every level of physical, preparedness they could possibly ask for. But if they wanted to branch deeper into the mental health side, how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, I mean for digging deeper into this like concept of, psychological flexibility in general. I mean one of my favorite books for that that's like not, super clinical is called A Liberated Mind by Stephen Hayes. He was the founder of acceptance and commitment therapy and he's the, one of the key kind of people doing a lot of research into this space. And so that's a great book to kind of it's both kind of explanatory but also like very actionable. Like there's a lot of like exercises and like things to practice. There's also a book called The Happiness Trap by Russ Harris. That's another sort of like um very accessible sort of book about these sort of
Journalistic,
things.
yeah.
Yeah. And then if you're interested in like, like exploring these more with, a therapist, maybe seeking out a therapist who practices acceptance and commitment therapy or that kind of style of work.
Mm.
Um, that would be kind of my first.
I know you've put this out there that you want your a nameplate on your desk in a special role as the Lumos mental health advisor. What she means is like, and you've done this with some folks in the past, is like when people are, hey, I think I want to like, want to see a therapist. I want to start working on this. That, certainly like, scope of practice and, ethically, that's not you,
Right.
right? You're a little too close to what we do here.
Yeah, I can
But
be your therapist.
right, you can't be there, but in
Mhm.
helping somebody find somebody who's a good fit or kind of like sifting through, resources
Mhm.
in the same way I do this with folks when they're like, they move to a new town, they're like, I'm looking for a gym. And I'm like, well, send me the 5 closest to you and I'll tell you which one I think like I would go to.
Yeah.
Yeah. So throwing that out there, Lumos World.
Yeah.
Um,
That's something that is really important to me is like helping, connect people to resources in the community. So like, yeah, if you're a member at the gym, if you're a friend of the gym, you know, definitely feel free to reach out, to me directly if you or if you have my information or reach out to Noah and I'd
I'll
love
give
to
you her
talk.
personal phone number. Don't
Love
worry.
to talk with you and help you. Yeah, in any way I can.
Sweet. Well, thank you for coming on, for putting a lot of, thought and effort into this. I appreciate it.
Of
Um,
course.
professionally and as my life partner. Uh, if you're like, man, I wish they talked more about this or something we, got into you thought was interesting and you'd like more on that or something that we didn't touch at all. If you're like, I don't know, I can't even think of a thing that you're like, oh, people talk about this as far as your mental health. What's dopamine? What's this? What's whatever? Uh, and you want to talk about that?